Bullies harass single mom's family, unaware she's a former Marine. The summer sun was still hanging in the sky, its golden light falling across the quiet suburban street where children usually rode their bikes and neighbors waved at one another from their front yards. But on this particular evening, there was no sense of calm. There was a woman standing in the middle of that street, with two young boys pressed tightly against her sides, and surrounding her were three men whose voices carried sharp, mocking tones. The woman's name was Alicia Carter. She was in her mid-30s with braided hair pulled back neatly and a calm face that often hid how much she carried inside. To most neighbors, she was just another single mother, always working hard, always walking with her two children, and always keeping to herself. She did not gossip on the street corners. She did not entertain long chats with neighbors leaning on mailboxes. Her life revolved around her children, Daniel, who was 9, and Marcus, who had just turned 7. That night, as she walked them back from the park, Alicia could sense that something was wrong before she even saw them. A low rumble of laughter echoed from the end of the street, sharp and mean-spirited. She held her sons closer, her steps tightening. And then they appeared, 3 young men standing together in a way that made it clear they were not interested in kindness. "Look who we have here," one of them sneered, stepping forward with a grin that did not reach his eyes. He wore a red bandana tied tight across his head, and his shoulders were squared with the false confidence of someone who enjoyed being feared. The second, taller and leaner, let out a laugh. "Just a lady and her 2 little boys. What's the hurry, scared?" Alicia stopped in the middle of the road. Her heart was calm but heavy. She had seen men like this before. Not these particular ones, but men who thrived on intimidation. Daniel's hand slipped into hers, his small fingers trembling. Marcus clung to her side, his wide eyes watching the men with confusion and fear. "Stay close to me," Alicia whispered softly to her sons. Her voice was low, steady, almost like a command given out of habit. The third man, younger than the others but eager to show off, smirked as he pointed at the children. "They look scared already. What's the matter, lady? Can't keep your kids safe?" The words hit the air like stones thrown into still water. Alicia tightened her arms around her sons. She did not shout back. She did not curse. She simply stared at them, her eyes cold and steady, the kind of look that came from years of discipline. Her silence seemed to anger them more. The first man stepped closer, his voice rising. "We're talking to you. Don't just stand there like you own the place." Daniel buried his face against his mother's arm. Marcus whimpered softly. Alicia's chest tightened not with fear, but with the powerful instinct of a protector. These were her children, her responsibility, her world. No one touched them. No one scared them. Her lips parted, and for the first time since the encounter began, she spoke, her voice cutting across the street. "Stay away from my kids." The words were not loud, but they carried weight. A command firm and sharp, as if spoken by someone who expected to be obeyed. The men froze for a second, glancing at each other. There was something unusual in her tone, something that did not belong to the timid. The taller one laughed again, but this time it was a little forced. "Or what? What are you going to do?" Alicia did not move. She did not raise her hands. She simply stared at them, her stance firm, her feet planted in the middle of the road as if she was rooted there. Behind her steady exterior, memories flashed quickly through her mind. The long sleepless nights on the training grounds, the weight of combat gear digging into her shoulders, the sound of drill instructors barking commands that broke weaker spirits but sharpened hers. The heat of the desert sun during deployment, the fear that lived in the eyes of those she had once protected, and the calm she had been forced to carry in the middle of storms. Those days were gone, but they had shaped her forever. She was no ordinary mother. She was a Marine. The men did not know it. Her children did not fully understand it. To the outside world, Alicia was just a single mom struggling to make ends meet, but she knew who she was. And though she had chosen a quieter life now, there were parts of her that would never be erased. Daniel peeked up at her, tears still forming in his eyes. He saw something different in her face. Not fear, not panic, but a steady strength, almost like she had been in situations worse than this before. Marcus whispered, his voice shaking. "Mom, are we going to be okay?" Alicia looked down at him and gave the smallest nod. "Yes, baby. We're going to be okay." The first man clenched his fists, ready to push further, but he hesitated again. Something about her stance, Shoulders squared, chin lifted, feet apart as if she was ready for anything, felt off. This was not the posture of someone who would break easily. Still, pride and ego kept them there. "You think you're tough?" the younger one sneered. "You're just one woman." Alicia's lips pressed together. She wanted to tell them the truth. That she had survived situations far deadlier than 3 loud boys on a suburban street. That she had learned to push through exhaustion when her body screamed to quit. That she had carried the weight of lives depending on her decisions. But she said nothing. Her silence was louder than any threat. The street was still. A car drove past at the far end, slowing for a moment, then moving on, unaware of the tension hanging heavy in the air. The bullies shifted uneasily, caught between wanting to prove themselves and feeling the invisible wall of authority radiating from her. They muttered under their breath, trying to cover their hesitation with more mocking words. But the cracks were already showing. Daniel tugged at his mother's hand. Marcus buried his face against her. Alicia pulled them closer, her arms like a shield. She was their safe place, their fortress, their home. And though the men still lingered, Alicia knew something they did not. They thought they had found a vulnerable target, but they were standing in front of someone trained for battles they could never imagine. This moment would pass. But the lesson for her children was only beginning. The street finally grew quiet again after the bullies drifted away, leaving behind their mocking laughter and empty threats. Alicia stood for a while in the middle of the road, still holding her children tightly, her arms trembling only now that the moment had passed. Daniel and Marcus clung to her sides, their small hearts racing against her. She could feel their fear, but she also knew this was a turning point for them. She guided them back to their small home just a few blocks down, her steps steady even though her chest carried the weight of what had just happened. When they reached the safety of their porch, Daniel finally looked up at her, his young face still pale. "Mom, why didn't you run?" he asked. Marcus added in a smaller voice, "They could have hurt us." Alicia knelt down in front of them, smoothing back Marcus's hair and holding Daniel's hand. Her eyes were calm, but her voice carried an authority they had not heard from her before. "I didn't run," she said slowly, "because sometimes running teaches the wrong lesson. You don't run from every shadow that tries to scare you. You stand your ground when it matters. You protect what you love." The boys listened, not fully understanding yet, but something in her words settled into them like seeds planted deep in soil. That night, after putting them to bed, Alicia sat alone at the small kitchen table. The house was quiet, the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. Her hands rested on a mug of tea, though she barely sipped from it. She stared out the window into the darkness of the street, remembering the faces of those men, but her mind wandered further back, years before this quiet life, years before she was simply Mom. She had once been Sergeant Alicia Carter of the United States Marine Corps. The memories came in waves. The first day of boot camp, when the sun was barely rising and she had stood in a line of recruits, her heart pounding in her chest. The drill instructor's voice had roared through the air like thunder, stripping away hesitation, fear, and excuses. She had wanted to quit more than once in those early weeks. The runs felt endless. The push-ups burned her muscles until she thought they would tear apart, and the weight of her pack during marches felt like carrying the world on her back. But she had not quit. Something deep inside her refused to break. She remembered the nights lying awake in the barracks, her body aching but her spirit sharp. She had stared at the ceiling, whispering to herself, "You can do this. You are stronger than this. Don't give up now." Those words had carried her through more than training. They had carried her through life itself. Deployment had been harder. The heat, the danger, the responsibility. She had seen fear in the eyes of civilians caught in conflict zones, and she had seen courage in the faces of her fellow Marines as they pushed forward despite exhaustion. Alicia had carried not only her own strength but also the weight of those who looked to her for leadership. And through it all, she had learned one truth. Fear is real, but it does not own you. Discipline, courage, and determination could stand taller than fear if you chose to let them. Now, years later, sitting in her small kitchen with her children sleeping in the next room, Alicia felt the old training rise up in her again. She was no longer in uniform. She no longer held rank. But the Marine in her had never left. People often saw her only as a single mother, quiet, working 2 jobs, carrying groceries up the porch steps. showing up at school meetings in tired clothes. They whispered sometimes, wondered how she managed alone, pitied her for being abandoned by her children's father. What they did not know was that she had faced worse storms than whispers. She had carried heavier loads than bills and groceries, and she had built herself into someone who would not break no matter how hard life pushed against her. As she sat there, Alicia thought of her sons again. She wanted them to know her story, not the medals, not the uniform, but the lesson behind it all. She wanted them to understand that strength was not about fists or weapons. It was about standing tall when fear tried to crush you. The next morning, Daniel and Marcus were quieter than usual at breakfast. They kept glancing at their mother, as though the image of her standing in the street facing down 3 bullies was still fresh in their minds. Finally, Daniel asked, "Mom, how were you so brave yesterday? Weren't you scared?" Alicia looked at him, then at Marcus. She placed her spoon down and folded her hands on the table. "Yes, I was scared," she admitted softly. "But bravery doesn't mean you don't feel fear. It means you don't let fear make the decisions for you. I've been scared many times in my life, but I learned something important. Fear can't win unless you give it power." Marcus frowned. "But how do you learn that?" Alicia's eyes softened. For a moment, she considered telling them everything. About boot camp, about deployment, about the times she had stared danger in the face and chosen to keep moving forward. But they were still young. They did not need all the details yet. They needed the lesson, the heart of it. "You learn it," she said slowly, "by not giving up. Every time life gets hard, you keep going. You take one more step. You try one more time. And eventually you realize that you're stronger than you thought." Daniel nodded slowly, trying to understand. Marcus leaned his head against her arm. That day, when Alicia dropped them off at school, she noticed a few neighbors watching her with new eyes. Word had already begun to spread about the incident. Some whispered, some nodded with respect. Alicia didn't seek their approval, but she knew something had shifted. The community was beginning to realize she was not as ordinary as they thought. For Alicia, though, the true victory was not what the neighbors thought. It was what her children were learning. She wanted them to see that even when life pushed you into corners, you could still choose to stand tall. Later that week, when Daniel came home with a scraped knee after a rough game of basketball at school, he surprised her by saying, "Mom, I didn't cry. I got back up just like you said." Alicia smiled softly, bandaging his knee. "That's my boy." Marcus, not wanting to be left out, added, "And I told the other kids not to laugh at him. I told them being strong means helping, not hurting." Alicia's chest swelled with pride. They were learning. Slowly, but surely, they were learning. That night, as she tucked them into bed, she whispered a silent promise to herself. She would continue teaching them what the Marines had taught her, not through lectures, but through the way she lived. Through the example she set. Through the courage she showed, not only in big moments, but in the quiet, everyday struggles. Because she knew this truth. She had once fought for her country, but her most important mission now was raising 2 boys into men who would understand strength, kindness, and resilience. And that mission she would never abandon. The morning after the incident, Alicia walked her sons to school the same way she always did. But the atmosphere was different. The boys walked a little closer to her, holding her hands tightly as if the memory of those men still lingered in their minds. Alicia's steps were calm, her expression steady, yet she could feel their uneasiness. She knew children carried fear longer than adults. To them, the memory was bigger, scarier, and harder to push aside. She needed to show them something more lasting than fear. She needed to show them that courage was not a moment, but a way of living. When she returned home, Alicia sat quietly on her porch, her gaze sweeping the neighborhood. The same houses stood, the same yards, the same trimmed hedges and painted mailboxes. But she noticed how neighbors looked at her differently now. Some nodded politely, some avoided her eyes, but most whispered. She heard bits of it when she passed. "That's the single mom who stood up to them. Did you hear she didn't even back down? I don't know what got into those boys, but she handled it better than I would have." Alicia didn't crave attention. She wasn't looking for validation. But she knew respect was earned not by shouting about who you were, but by standing firm when it mattered. That evening, as the sun lowered, Daniel sat at the kitchen table doing homework. Marcus was on the couch building a tower with his toy blocks. Alicia moved between them, cooking dinner while watching their small faces. Daniel looked up suddenly. Mom, what if they come back? Alicia paused, setting down the spoon she held. She wiped her hands and walked over to the table, kneeling beside him. His eyes were wide, filled with a worry that only children carried, an innocent fear of things repeating. If they come back, Alicia said firmly, we will do the same thing we did before. We'll stand together, and you know what? They'll see again that we are not afraid. But you were, right? Marcus asked from the couch, surprising her. I saw your face. You were scared too. Alicia smiled gently. Yes, I was scared. But being brave doesn't mean you don't feel afraid. It means you don't let fear tell you what to do. Fear can scream in your ear, but you still get to decide how you act. The boys exchanged looks. Slowly, Daniel nodded. Marcus whispered, so we just don't let fear win. That's right, Alicia said. We don't let fear win. The conversation sank deep into their young minds. And for Alicia, it was more than just teaching them. It was reminding herself of the discipline she had carried years ago. The discipline she still carried now. 2 nights later, Alicia was walking home again with her sons when she noticed shadows at the end of the street. The same group of bullies leaned against a car, their laughter echoing across the pavement. Her heart tightened, but her pace didn't falter. Daniel noticed first. Mom, it's them. Marcus grabbed her hand quickly. Let's go back, but Alicia didn't turn around. She squeezed their hands and said softly, we're not going back. We keep walking. This is our street too. The boys hesitated but followed her lead. The bullies noticed and straightened. One of them called out, well, look who it is. Back for round 2? They moved toward her again, smirking, trying to intimidate. But this time, Alicia stopped in the middle of the road before they could surround her. She turned to face them head-on, her sons behind her. Her voice was calm but powerful. Enough, stay away from my kids. The air went still. Her words were sharp, not desperate but commanding. It wasn't just a mother pleading for safety. It was the authority of someone who had been trained never to back down. The tallest one stepped forward, trying to act bold. And if we don't? Alicia's eyes narrowed slightly. She didn't raise her fists or shout. She simply stood her ground, her posture unwavering. Shoulders back, chin lifted, feet firmly planted. It wasn't aggression, it was confidence. The type of confidence that unsettled people who thrived on weakness. Inside, her sons were trembling, but they could feel something shift in the air. Their mother was not afraid. She looked stronger than the 3 men combined. Daniel whispered behind her, she's not moving. Marcus clutched her arm tighter. She's not scared. The bullies faltered. They expected panic, maybe tears. They expected her to beg or rush away. But the steadiness in her voice, the firmness in her stance unsettled them. The younger one muttered, she's crazy, man. Let's just go. But the leader didn't want to lose face. He smirked, though his eyes flickered with hesitation. You think you're tough? You're just a mom. Alicia took a single step closer, her gaze locked on his. Her voice dropped lower, but each word was clear. I am a mother, and that makes me tougher than you'll ever understand. Silence followed. The boys' mouths fell open, stunned by her words. The bullies exchanged glances, their bravado shrinking with each passing second. Finally, with a frustrated scoff, the leader turned away. Forget this. She's not worth it. They muttered to each other, walking off down the street, their laughter forced this time. Daniel and Marcus let out the breaths they'd been holding. Daniel whispered, Mom, you didn't even touch them. But they left. Alicia turned and crouched down, holding their shoulders. That's because sometimes you don't need to fight with your hands. Sometimes standing your ground, showing you won't back down, that's enough. Marcus blinked up at her. So, standing strong is stronger than fighting? Alicia smiled. Most of the time, yes. That night, after tucking her sons into bed, Alicia sat alone again, thinking. She wasn't proud that her children had been exposed to danger, but she was proud that they had witnessed something greater. That courage wasn't just about muscle or yelling or fists. It was about refusing to give fear the power it wanted. She thought of her Marine days again, of missions where the team had to move forward despite fear, of nights when silence was their strongest weapon, of moments when simply refusing to break was what carried them through. Now she was passing those lessons on in a different way. Her battlefield had changed, but her mission hadn't. She was still a protector. She was still standing her ground, and now her children were beginning to learn how to do the same. That night, long after Daniel and Marcus had fallen asleep, Alicia sat alone in the dimly lit living room. The hum of the ceiling fan filled the silence, and the faint glow of the street lamp outside leaked through the blinds. She leaned back on the old couch, her hands resting on her knees, her mind heavy with memories. The street confrontation had stirred something deep inside her, something she had tried for years to tuck away in the past. But memories do not vanish so easily. They wait, quiet and patient, until the right moment brings them rushing back. And tonight, they returned all at once. Alicia closed her eyes and saw herself years younger, standing on the parade grounds of Marine boot camp. Her uniform had been stiff and new, her boots heavy, her body aching from drills that seemed endless. The sun was merciless and the instructors' voices were relentless. "Drop and give me 20. Move faster, Carter, faster. You think this is hard? Wait until you're out there." She had wanted to cry those first weeks. She had wanted to quit. Her muscles screamed, her lungs burned, and every day felt like a war against herself. But she never allowed herself to give in. Each time she thought she had reached her limit, she pushed one step further. That was where she first learned the difference between fear and failure. Fear was natural. It lived in every recruit's chest. But failure, that came only if you gave fear permission to control you. Alicia remembered the long marches with packs that seemed heavier than her own body weight. Step after step, blisters on her feet, sweat soaking through her uniform, she had whispered to herself, "One more step. Just one more step." And every time she thought she couldn't go further, she found that she could. It wasn't just physical training. It was mental, emotional, spiritual. The Marines didn't just build strong bodies, they built unbreakable wills. She opened her eyes in the present and looked toward her son's bedroom door. A small smile crossed her lips. They had seen her strength this week, but they didn't yet know where it came from. One day she would tell them about these nights. Not the battles or the violence, she would never burden them with those scars, but the lessons, the discipline, the resilience. Her memories carried her further, to deployment. The desert heat pressing down like fire, the endless horizon of sand stretching out in every direction. She remembered standing watch at night, her weapon resting against her, listening for sounds in the darkness. The silence was heavy, but her training kept her calm. She had learned to control her breathing, to steady her thoughts, to be alert without panic. She remembered the faces of her fellow Marines, brothers and sisters, some barely older than she had been, all carrying the same weight of duty. They leaned on each other in moments of exhaustion, pushed each other when one faltered, and stood together no matter the cost. One night came back sharper than the rest. A night when fear had clawed at all of them. She had been leading a small group on patrol, the desert stretching silent and vast. Every shadow felt alive, every sound magnified in the stillness. One of the younger Marines whispered that he was scared. His voice had cracked, betraying how close he was to panic. Alicia had turned to him, her own heart racing, and said calmly, "Fear is fine. But fear doesn't decide what we do. We do." Her words steadied him, and in that moment she realized something. Leadership wasn't about being fearless. It was about showing others how to keep moving forward, even when fear was present. She leaned her head back against the couch cushion now, breathing deeply. The lessons of those years weren't just for soldiers. They were for life. She thought about her children again, Daniel with his quiet intelligence and Marcus with his tender heart. They were still so young, so innocent, but the world around them wasn't always kind. They would face bullies, challenges, and doubts. They would feel fear just as she had. Her duty now was to teach them what the Marines had taught her. That fear didn't mean defeat, that strength came from within, and that discipline could carry you further than you ever imagined. She whispered softly into the empty room, as if speaking to her children through the walls. "One day you'll understand. Strength isn't about fists. It's about refusing to break." The next morning, Alicia woke early, her routine as disciplined as it had been in her Marine years. She made breakfast, packed lunches, and helped the boys get ready for school. On the outside, life looked ordinary. But inside her, she felt a fire reignited. Walking them to school, she noticed how they glanced around nervously, half expecting to see the bullies again. She stopped in the middle of the sidewalk and crouched down to their level. "Boys," she said gently, "I need you to remember something. The other day you saw me stand in front of those men. Do you know why I did that?" Daniel shrugged. Because you were protecting us. Yes, Alicia nodded. But also because I wanted you to see that strength doesn't mean fighting. It means standing your ground. It means not letting people scare you into shrinking. I learned that a long time ago, and now I want you to learn it too. Marcus frowned thoughtfully. But what if we're still scared? Alicia smiled softly. You can be scared. I was scared too. But scared doesn't mean weak. You just don't let fear tell you what to do. You decide for yourself. They both nodded slowly, her words sinking deeper than she realized. That afternoon, while she waited outside the school gates, one of her neighbors approached her. Mrs. Reynolds, an older woman with kind eyes, had overheard whispers about the confrontation. I heard what happened the other night, she said. You're a brave woman, Alicia. Not many would have handled it the way you did. Alicia offered a small smile. I just did what I had to do. Mrs. Reynolds tilted her head. Still, not everyone would have stood so strong. Where did you learn that kind of courage? Alicia hesitated for a moment. She rarely spoke of her past. Most of the neighborhood didn't know about her service. But she could see the genuine curiosity in the woman's eyes. Life taught me, Alicia finally said. Discipline, sacrifice, you learn not to let fear win. Mrs. Reynolds smiled warmly. Well, your boys are lucky. They'll grow up knowing what real strength looks like. Alicia's chest tightened with quiet pride. She didn't need applause. What mattered was that her sons were learning the lesson. That night, as she tucked Daniel and Marcus into bed, Marcus asked suddenly, Mom, have you ever been scared before? Like really scared? Alicia paused. She sat on the edge of his bed, brushing his hair back gently. Yes, sweetheart. Many times, Daniel leaned forward. But you didn't run? No, Alicia said softly. Because fear is only a feeling. It doesn't control me. I control me. The boys grew quiet, absorbing her words. As she turned off the light and stepped into the hallway, Alicia thought back to her Marine days again. The flashbacks weren't just memories, they were reminders. The same strength that had carried her through war was the strength she now poured into raising her children. Her life had changed, but her mission remained the same: protect, guide, and teach. And as she closed her eyes that night, Alicia knew this truth. Her sons would one day face their own battles. But because of what she was showing them now, they would never face them unprepared. The neighborhood began to change after that week. People who had once looked past Alicia now glanced at her with new respect. It wasn't the kind of respect that came from gossip or curiosity. It was quieter, heavier. It came from the way she carried herself, the way she stood tall, the way whispers spread about how she had faced down men who thrived on intimidation. But respect from strangers wasn't what mattered most to her. What mattered was how her sons were starting to see her differently. Daniel, the older one, became more observant. He studied the way she walked into rooms with calm confidence. He noticed that when she spoke, she didn't rush, didn't shout, and yet people listened. Marcus, the younger one, clung to her still. But now it wasn't only for safety, it was also out of admiration. He looked at her as though she was more than his mom. To him, she was a shield, a hero. Alicia didn't want them to worship her. She wanted them to learn from her. To see that strength wasn't about fists or anger, it was about respect. One afternoon, while walking home from school, Daniel stopped on the sidewalk. Mom, he asked, why didn't those men try to fight you? You didn't even hit them, but they looked scared. Alicia slowed her steps and looked down at him. Marcus tilted his head too, curious. Because respect, she explained, doesn't always come from fighting. Sometimes it comes from showing people you won't bend even when they try to break you. Bullies don't know what to do when someone doesn't fear them. They mistake silence for weakness, but when you stand tall, they realize they can't control you. Daniel frowned, deep in thought. So, respect is stronger than fear? In the long run, yes, Alicia said. Fear makes people run. Respect makes them stop. Her words sank into them, though they were still young. But she could see it, the spark of understanding beginning to grow. That same evening, while Alicia was cooking dinner, a knock sounded at the door. She wiped her hands on a towel and opened it to find an older man standing there. It was Mr. Hawkins, one of the neighbors who often sat on his porch reading the newspaper. I heard about what happened, he said slowly. His voice carried the weight of years, thoughtful and steady. I just wanted to say, you handled it the right way. You didn't back down, but you didn't escalate either. That takes strength most folks don't have. Alicia offered a polite smile. "Thank you, Mr. Hawkins," he nodded once. "Your boys are lucky to have you teaching them. Not many kids get to see what real courage looks like." She closed the door quietly after he left, her heart swelling not because of his words, but because the lesson she was trying to pass down was reaching further than she realized. A few days later, the bullies returned. This time, Alicia saw them from a distance as she and her boys walked back from the grocery store. They were leaning near the corner, laughing loudly, trying to look confident. Daniel's grip on the grocery bag tightened. Marcus whispered, "Mom, it's them again." Alicia took a deep breath, steadying herself. She set the grocery bags down gently, turned and placed both hands on her son's shoulders. "Listen to me," she said softly, locking eyes with them. "This time I want you to watch. Not because you need to be afraid, but because I want you to see how respect works." The boys nodded nervously. The bullies noticed her and approached. Their leader smirked, his voice mocking. "Back again? Didn't think you'd still be around after last time." But Alicia didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice. She looked at him with steady eyes, her posture calm but unyielding. "You need to understand something," she said evenly. "I don't fear you. You're not in control here. My children deserve peace, and I will protect that peace. If you have any sense, you'll walk away now." The street went quiet. The bullies shifted uncomfortably, caught off guard by the firmness of her tone. It wasn't anger. It wasn't desperation. It was authority. One of the younger ones muttered, "She's serious, man." The leader tried to laugh it off, but his eyes betrayed his unease. He looked at her, then at the children, then back at his friends. And for the first time, Alicia saw it, the flicker of respect. Not admiration, not kindness, but respect. The kind that comes when someone realizes they've been standing in the presence of a strength they cannot shake. Finally, with a shrug, the leader muttered, "Fine, whatever, we'll go." They turned and walked away, their laughter fading as they disappeared down the street. Daniel and Marcus stared wide-eyed at their mother. Daniel whispered, "Mom, they left because of what you said." Alicia knelt down, meeting their eyes. Yes, words can be more powerful than fists. Respect lasts longer than fear. And sometimes when people see you stand strong, they can't help but respect it, even if they don't admit it. That night, Daniel stayed awake longer than usual. When Alicia came to check on him, he sat up in bed, his face thoughtful. "Mom," he said quietly, "I think I get it now. You weren't just protecting us, you were teaching us too." Alicia sat beside him, brushing his hair back gently. "Yes, sweetheart. One day you'll face people who try to scare you or push you down. And I won't always be there. So I need you to know that respect, real respect, comes from standing firm, from living with courage, from treating others the right way. That's what lasts." Daniel nodded slowly. "I want to be like you." Tears pricked Alicia's eyes, but she blinked them away. She kissed his forehead and whispered, "Be better than me. That's what every parent hopes for." The following weekend, Alicia took her boys to the park. They played on the swings, laughed on the slides, and chased each other in the grass. For a while, everything was light again, free of shadows. But when they stopped for water, Daniel looked up at her with a sudden question. "Mom, do you think those men respect us now?" Alicia thought for a moment. Then she said, "They may not like us. They may never apologize. But they saw something in us they didn't expect. And yes, I believe they respect that, even if they don't say it out loud." Marcus leaned against her. "So, respect is like winning without fighting?" Alicia smiled, pulling them close. "Exactly. Winning doesn't always mean beating someone down. Sometimes it means rising so high that no one can drag you down." The boys fell quiet, holding on to her words as tightly as they held onto her hands. That night, Alicia sat by the window, the cool air drifting in. She thought again of her Marine days, of standing tall in the face of fear, of the respect that came not from shouting, but from living with discipline and courage. And now, she was passing that same lesson to her children. She realized something important. The bullies had not just given her a challenge. They had given her an opportunity to show her sons that fear could turn into respect, that courage could outlast intimidation, and that true strength wasn't about fists or noise. It was about calm, steady resilience. And as she whispered a prayer of thanks for the quiet night, Alicia knew that her mission as a mother wasn't only to protect her children's bodies, It was to shape their spirits, to make sure that when life tried to break them, they would stand tall just as she had. The house was quiet except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the old clock on the wall. Alicia sat at the kitchen table late into the evening, her sons asleep in their room. She stared at the papers spread out before her, bills, notes from school, grocery lists, but her mind wasn't on the numbers. It was on Daniel and Marcus. They were growing fast. Daniel was already learning how to be independent, trying to help her with small chores, asking questions that revealed how quickly he was maturing. Marcus was softer, more sensitive, but his heart was fierce in its own way. Both of them looked at her with a trust so pure that sometimes it made her chest ache. She wanted them to carry that trust into adulthood, not as blind faith, but as a lesson. Her children had seen her strength in action. They had witnessed her confront the bullies, stand her ground, and turn fear into respect. But now Alicia knew it was time for them to understand why. Strength was not just for defense, it was a foundation for life. The next morning, Alicia decided to change her routine. Instead of simply walking her boys to school, she woke them up early and asked them to meet her in the living room. They shuffled in sleepily, rubbing their eyes, still in their pajamas. "Mom, why are we up so early?" Marcus yawned. Alicia smiled gently. "Because I want to teach you something important. A lesson you'll carry forever." She had laid out 3 chairs in the middle of the room. She sat on one and gestured for them to sit on the others. Her voice was calm, but there was a seriousness in her tone that caught their attention. "Boys," she began, "the world is not always kind. You've seen that already. People will try to scare you, push you down, or make you feel small. But you cannot let them decide who you are. You must decide that for yourselves." Daniel frowned slightly. "But what if they're stronger than us?" Alicia leaned forward, her eyes steady on his. "Strength isn't only about muscles. It's about your mind, your heart, and your spirit. If you know who you are, if you stand by what's right, then even the strongest bully cannot take that from you." Marcus tilted his head. "Like how you stood in the street?" "Yes," Alicia nodded. "That was one example. But there are many ways to stand strong. Sometimes it's standing up for yourself. Sometimes it's standing up for someone else. And sometimes it's refusing to do something wrong, even when everyone else is doing it." The boys listened carefully, their young faces lit with curiosity. To make her lesson clear, Alicia walked over to the small bookshelf in the corner of the room. She pulled down a heavy photo album, one she rarely opened. Sitting back down, she placed it on the table. The leather cover was worn, the pages thick with years of history. "What's that?" Daniel asked. "Our family's story," Alicia replied. She opened it carefully, flipping past childhood pictures and reaching the section where her time in uniform was captured. The boys leaned in, eyes wide. There was Alicia, years younger, dressed in her Marine uniform. Her expression was serious, her stance proud. "That's you," Marcus whispered. "Yes," Alicia said softly. "This was before you were born. I was part of the Marines. We trained hard, lived with discipline, and learned to be strong even in the hardest times. It wasn't easy, but it taught me lessons I still use today." She flipped to a photo of herself standing beside her fellow Marines. Sand stretched behind them, the sun blazing overhead. Their faces were worn, but their postures were strong. "What were you doing there?" Daniel asked. "Protecting," Alicia answered simply. "Protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. Protecting each other. It was dangerous, but it showed me the power of unity and courage." Marcus pointed to the photo. "Were you scared?" "Yes," she admitted. "Many times. But being scared didn't stop me. Fear is natural. Courage is choosing to keep going anyway." The boys stared at the pictures, silent. Slowly, Alicia closed the album and set it aside. "You see," she said gently, "everything I learned back then, I'm teaching you now. Not because I want you to be soldiers, but because I want you to be strong men. Men who will stand up when life tries to push them down. Men who will protect what matters. Men who will never let fear win." The lesson didn't end there. That afternoon, Alicia gave them small challenges. She asked Daniel to help Marcus with a puzzle, even when he got frustrated. She asked Marcus to try carrying something heavier than usual, teaching him that effort mattered more than success. She watched them stumble, complain, and finally figure it out. When they succeeded, she said, "See? You thought you couldn't do it, but you did. That's how strength works. You don't find it until you push yourself past what feels comfortable." Her sons nodded. slowly realizing that strength wasn't a magical gift, it was built, piece by piece, through small choices. A few days later, an opportunity to reinforce the lesson came unexpectedly. At school, Daniel saw another boy being teased for his stutter. The bullies laughed, mimicking his words. Daniel froze for a moment, fear whispering at him to stay silent. But then he remembered his mother's words. Sometimes standing strong means standing up for someone else. He stepped forward, his voice firm. "Stop it, that's not funny." The bullies turned on him, but Daniel didn't back down. His heart pounded, but he stood tall just like his mother had. Eventually, the bullies walked away, muttering. That evening, Daniel told Alicia what happened. She listened carefully, her eyes shining with quiet pride. "You were scared, weren't you?" she asked. "Yes," Daniel admitted. "But I didn't let it stop me." Alicia pulled him into a hug. "That's courage, my son. I am proud of you." Marcus learned his lesson too, in a gentler way. At the park, he noticed a younger child struggling to climb the slide. Other kids were rushing past, ignoring him. Marcus hesitated at first, then walked over and offered his hand. "Here, I'll help you." The child smiled and accepted. Together they made it to the top. When Alicia saw, her heart swelled. Later she knelt beside Marcus and said, "You showed strength today too. Strength is not always loud, it can be kindness. Helping others is a kind of courage too." Marcus grinned proudly. Every day after that, Alicia continued weaving lessons into their lives. She didn't preach long speeches. She taught through actions, through stories, through small challenges. She wanted her boys to know that life would not always be gentle, but they could always choose to be strong. One evening, as they all sat around the dinner table, Daniel looked at her seriously. "Mom," he said, "I think I understand now. You weren't just protecting us from those men. You were teaching us how to protect ourselves too." Alicia smiled softly. "Yes, Daniel. That's the greatest gift I can give you. Not just keeping you safe, but showing you how to stand strong when I'm not there," Marcus added. "And showing us how to be kind too." She reached across the table, holding both their hands. "Exactly. Strength without kindness is just power. But strength with kindness, that changes everything." That night, after the boys were asleep, Alicia sat quietly by their beds, watching them breathe. She thought about the life she had lived, the battles, the sacrifices, the nights filled with fear. And she thought about the life she was living now, the lessons, the challenges, the love that filled her home. Her mission had changed, but it was no less important. Once she had been a Marine, protecting strangers in faraway lands. Now she was a mother, shaping two boys into men who would one day walk the world with courage, kindness, and strength. And as she whispered a prayer over them, she knew this truth. The greatest lesson she could ever give her children was not her protection, it was her example, because one day they would no longer need her shield. They would become their own. The weeks passed, and the quiet suburban street where Alicia lived seemed different now. It was not the houses or the trees that had changed, it was the way people looked at her. Neighbors who once only offered polite nods now stopped to speak with her. Parents whispered her name with respect. Children pointed at her house and told stories about how she had stood firm against bullies. But Alicia didn't care about becoming a neighborhood tale. Her real focus was her boys. Every morning, as she watched Daniel and Marcus put on their backpacks and walk out the door, she knew the lesson was working. They stood a little straighter now. They faced the world with a quiet confidence that hadn't been there before. They were no longer just children being protected. They were learning to protect themselves, and in their own way to protect others. One evening, Alicia walked into the living room to find Daniel sitting at the table with a notebook open. He was writing carefully, his tongue peeking out in concentration. Marcus sat beside him, coloring. "What are you working on?" Alicia asked, leaning over. Daniel looked up, his face serious. "It's an essay for school. The teacher asked us to write about someone we look up to." Alicia smiled softly. "And who did you choose?" Daniel hesitated, then pushed the notebook toward her. On the top line, in his neat handwriting, were the words, "The person I admire most, my mom." Her breath caught. She read the first few sentences, her chest tightening with emotion. "My mom is strong, not just because she is tough, but because she never gives up. She teaches me and my brother that being brave means not letting fear decide what we do. She shows us that kindness is strength too. My mom is the bravest person I know." Alicia pressed her hand to her mouth, her eyes stinging. She looked down at Daniel, who shifted nervously. "Do you like it?" he asked quietly. "I love it," Alicia whispered. "More than you'll ever know." Marcus chimed in proudly. "I told him to write that. Because you're like a superhero, Mom, but better because you're real." Alicia laughed softly, pulling them both into her arms. "I'm not a superhero. I'm just your mom." Daniel shook his head. "You're both." A few days later, the school principal called Alicia. There had been an incident on the playground. Her heart sank at first, fearing the worst. But when she arrived, she found Daniel standing beside another boy, a smaller child who looked shaken but unharmed. The principal explained. Some older kids were picking on him. Daniel stepped in. He told them to stop, and when they didn't, he stood his ground until a teacher came over. Alicia looked at her son, whose face was calm, though his hands trembled slightly. "Were you scared?" she asked him on the way home. Daniel nodded. "Yes, but I remembered what you said. Fear doesn't get to decide." "I do." She reached over and squeezed his shoulder, pride swelling in her chest. "That's exactly right." For Alicia, it was confirmation that her lessons were taking root. The strength she had carried from her Marine days was no longer just hers. It was living on in her children. Meanwhile, the bullies who had once haunted their street no longer appeared. Word had spread not only in the neighborhood but beyond. People whispered that the single mom on Maplewood Street was not someone to mess with. Not because she fought, not because she yelled, but because she stood firm. Respect had replaced fear. And with it, peace had settled over their little corner of the world. One evening, as Alicia sat on her porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, Mrs. Reynolds, her kind neighbor, joined her. "You've changed this street, you know," the older woman said. Alicia raised her eyebrows. "How so?" "You showed people what quiet strength looks like," Mrs. Reynolds replied. "You didn't need to call the police. You didn't need to cause a scene. You just stood your ground, and now everyone here feels safer. That's something to be proud of." Alicia looked down at her hands, modest as ever. "I didn't do it for the street. I did it for my boys," Mrs. Reynolds smiled knowingly. "That's why it worked. Because you weren't proving anything for yourself. You were teaching them. And in doing so, you've inspired everyone else too." The true measure of her impact became clear weeks later. During a community meeting at the local center, parents gathered to discuss safety, and Alicia found herself being asked to speak. At first she resisted. She wasn't one for the spotlight. But then she looked at Daniel and Marcus sitting in the front row, their eyes bright with pride, and she knew she couldn't say no. She stood at the podium, her voice steady. "I'm not here to tell you I'm special. I'm just a mother like many of you. I've faced fear just like you have. But I learned something important in my life, that fear doesn't get to control us. Courage isn't about being fearless. It's about choosing to do what's right even when you are afraid." She paused, her gaze sweeping the room. Parents leaned forward. Children listened quietly. "I don't want my sons to grow up thinking strength is about fists or shouting. I want them to know strength is about respect, kindness, and standing tall when life pushes you down. If I can leave them with that lesson, then I've done my job as their mother." The room erupted into quiet applause. Not the loud, showy kind, but the kind filled with genuine respect. Alicia stepped down, her sons rushing into her arms. "You were amazing, Mom," Marcus whispered. Daniel grinned. Everyone listened. Just like the bullies did. Alicia hugged them tight, her heart full. Later that night, as she tucked them into bed, Daniel asked, "Mom, do you think we'll be strong enough when we grow up?" Alicia smiled softly, brushing his hair back. "You already are. You're learning every day, and strength doesn't mean never falling. It means getting back up no matter what." Marcus yawned and added, "And being kind, too." "Yes," Alicia nodded. "And being kind, too." She kissed their foreheads, whispering a silent prayer of gratitude as they drifted off to sleep. When she returned to the living room, Alicia sat quietly, reflecting. She thought about her past, her Marine training, the sacrifices, the sleepless nights on patrol. She thought about the present, raising 2 boys on her own, facing down fear, teaching lessons through example. Her journey had been hard, filled with battles seen and unseen. But as she looked toward the future, she felt peace.